Poor single mom. Kissed a billionaire to save his life, and then he does something no one expected. Call 911 right now. He's turning blue. The mop slipped from her hands and hit the polished floor with a sharp crack that sliced through the heavy silence of the room. Marissa Lane didn't think. She just ran. Only minutes earlier, the boardroom on the 37th floor of Whitaker and Company had been filled with the quiet confidence of power. Graham Whitaker, founder and chief executive officer of the corporation, had been standing at the head of a long mahogany table, gesturing gently as he spoke of revitalizing the south side of Chicago. His voice had been deep and steady, with the measured cadence of a man who had led for decades. Every word seemed crafted, his presence unshakable. Then his voice had faltered. His frame wavered. One hand had clutched at his chest. His breath had come short, broken, and then he had crumpled to the ground. 6 high-ranking executives draped in suits worth thousands had frozen. Not one of them had moved. Not one had called for help. One had muttered, "He's probably joking." Another whispered, "Call security." But Graham Whitaker hadn't moved. His lips were no longer red, but deep purple. Marissa hadn't waited. She didn't belong in that room. She was just the overnight cleaning staff finishing up the hallway outside after a 12-hour shift. But when the cry for help came, she had burst in. No hesitation, no permission. She had walked past the scent of expensive cologne, past gleaming leather shoes, past faces frozen in disbelief. "What are you doing? Get out of here!" a man had shouted. "You're not allowed in here," a woman had added with thinly veiled disdain. "I know CPR," Marissa had said loudly, her voice firm. No one had moved. No one had helped. Graham Whitaker had lain on his side, one arm limp on the carpet, eyes shut tight. Marissa had dropped to her knees. Her fingers found no pulse in his neck. She tilted his head back, pinched his nose, and leaned in. "Oh my God, is she kissing him?" a woman had whispered, horrified. "That's disgusting," another voice had said, followed by the soft click of someone recording video. Marissa didn't care. She had once taken a free first aid class at the Southside Community Center in exchange for food vouchers. And now in this sterile room of silence and wealth, her instructor's voice came back clearer than anything else. "If they're not breathing, you are their lungs." 2 rescue breaths. Then she laced her fingers together and started compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Something hard slammed into her shoulder. She clenched her teeth, kept going. 5, 6, 7. "You poor trash. Get off of him." Noise erupted around her. Footsteps, raised voices, panic. But Marissa stayed with it. Sweat slipped down her brow. Her hands ached. Her shoulders burned. Still she pressed. "Don't die," she whispered. "Please don't die here." 26, 27, 28. Someone yanked her shoulder. Marissa shook them off, leaned in for 2 more breaths. Suddenly Graham's body jerked. He coughed violently, then gasped, sucking in air like a man dragged from the bottom of a lake. He was breathing. Marissa dropped back onto the floor. Her body trembled. Everything hurt, but he was alive. Immediately the suit swarmed. "Mr. Whitaker, can you hear us? Stay with us, help is coming." The boardroom doors burst open. Paramedics rushed in. One turned back and asked who started CPR. "I did," Marissa said quietly. Before she could say another word, a silver-haired man approached. His name tag read, "Michael Langston, Chief Financial Officer." His eyes narrowed as they scanned her from head to toe, as though she had brought filth into the heart of the empire. "What's your name?" "Marissa Lane," she said, standing tall. "I clean the 25th floor." "You put your mouth on the most powerful man in this city." He wasn't breathing. "I'll have every security camera reviewed. You need to leave now. Don't come back unless authorized." Her throat tightened. Her shoulder throbbed. She looked around the room where she had just saved a life. Not a single thank you. She bent, picked up her mop with trembling hands, and walked out. She didn't know that the moment those doors closed behind her, her life had taken a turn. No one, not even she, could have predicted. You're listening to this story on Emotional Echoes, where we bring you raw moments, heart-stirring journeys, and deeply human messages that linger long after the final word. If Marissa's story is reaching into something within you, take a moment to subscribe, hit like, and share this video so that more people can experience the beauty tucked within everyday courage. Where are you listening from? Leave us a comment below to tell us where you are and how you're feeling in this moment. Sometimes a story that seems small can be the bridge that connects hearts across thousands of miles. And now we invite you to continue with part 2 of this remarkable story. Marissa Lane pushed her janitor's cart out of the boardroom, like a shadow slipping quietly beneath the sterile glow of fluorescent lights, moving through a gauntlet of staring eyes and unspoken judgments. The door closed behind her with a muted click, and not a single voice rose to offer thanks. From inside, she could still hear the quick steps, the urgent tones, the gathering voices surrounding the man she had pulled back from the narrow edge between life and death. But it all belonged to a world apart, a world she had never been part of, a world that had never, not for a second, considered her one of its own. The hallway stretched before her, gleaming and spotless from her own careful labor, but now it seemed to stretch endlessly, like a gulf between herself and something that had just been stripped away. Marissa kept her head down and made her way to the service elevator. Her eyes stung, but she didn't cry. She had long since grown used to being ignored, to being looked through like glass. But this time, that invisibility came wrapped in something heavier, something crueler than anything she had carried before. The elevator took her down to the maintenance floor. She returned to the locker room, opened her small metal cabinet, pulled out her worn handbag, and unhooked the employee badge from around her neck, dropping it into the bag without a word. In her mind, the cold voice of Michael Langston echoed, still the chief financial officer whose gaze had pierced her like she was nothing more than a smudge on marble. Inappropriate conduct. Those words looped in her head. What had she done if not save a man's life? But in their eyes, the real transgression was not touching him to revive him. It was daring to touch someone from a world she had no right to reach. Above her, the ambulance had just pulled away. Graham Whitaker lay strapped to a gurney, headed for the city's central hospital. He was still breathing. His heartbeat had stabilized, though he remained groggy and unaware. One of the paramedics had asked who performed the CPR, but no one had answered. They had looked at each other, then changed the subject. No one wanted to admit that the person who had saved the company's founder was a janitor. At that same moment, far below, Marissa stepped out the rear employee exit of the building, the door clicking shut behind her with no one waiting, no one to see her off. The early morning wind slipped under her thin coat and made her shiver. The city was already stirring to life. Yellow taxis zipped past headlights flickering off the towering glass of downtown skyscrapers. She entered the subway station, collapsed onto a cold plastic bench. Her fingers clenched tightly around her bag, red welts still marking the skin from where she had pressed her hands into that man's chest, trying to bring him back. Her left shoulder throbbed where she had been struck, but she barely noticed. She sat there staring into the quiet distance, heart beating slowly, heavily. No thank you. No one asking if she was all right. A little while later, her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. It was a message from the company's internal alert system. A single clipped line lit up the screen. Employee Marissa Lane, suspended pending internal investigation. Do not return to the building until further notice. She read it once, then again, a third time. The words slammed shut like a door thrown hard in her face. Her mind reeled, trying to catch up with what it meant. She typed a short message to her direct supervisor asking for clarification. No reply. She called. No one answered. Marissa closed the phone and leaned back against the cold brick wall of the subway station. The middle-aged woman sitting beside her glanced over, then quickly turned away, as if proximity to Marissa might bring trouble. Marissa didn't blame her. She was wearing a cheap jacket that still carried the scent of bleach, her hair pulled back in a hasty knot, her face drawn in gray from too many sleepless nights. Who would believe someone like her had just saved the life of one of the richest men in Chicago? The train arrived. She stood, stepped aboard, and found an empty seat by the window. Outside, the first rays of sun crept across the tall glass buildings. People in pale suits moved briskly along the sidewalks, coffee in one hand, smartphones in the other, sliding into their day as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Marissa leaned her forehead against the window and closed her eyes. Somewhere out there, Graham Whitaker's heart was still beating, fueled in part by her breath, by her hands, by her will not to let him go. And yet all she had been given in return was a look of contempt and a silent dismissal, a message that erased her presence without so much as a thank you, without justice, without dignity. And she had no idea that this was only the beginning. Marissa stepped out of the train station just as the city fully came to life, its veins pulsing with the indifferent rhythm of morning traffic and crowds that moved like parts of some massive, unfeeling machine. The January wind was sharp enough to bite through the thin coat she had worn through her overnight shift, curling beneath the fabric and pressing against her skin like ice. The bag slung over her shoulder felt heavier with every step, though it carried almost nothing inside, just an empty lunch container, a pair of gloves, and a nearly dead phone. Each block she walked toward home seemed to stretch longer as the company's message repeated itself in her mind with merciless clarity. Suspended. Do not return. Internal investigation. The words weighed on her chest like stones. No one had said thank you. No one had acknowledged that she had saved a man's life. All they saw was a cleaning woman who had dared to touch a man too powerful for her to be near. Her apartment sat in a crumbling building on the south side of Chicago, where the sounds of honking horns, shouting children, and muffled music from upstairs all blended into the background noise of daily life. The iron staircase to the third floor groaned beneath her steps, its peeling paint exposing rusted patches that looked like dried blood. Door number 6 leaned off its hinges, the lock already replaced 3 times in the past year due to jams. She slid the key into the slot, pushed the door open. "I heard you coming, Mom." Jacob ran out from the living room, hair tousled, a broken pencil clutched in one hand. He threw his arms around her, his face lighting up. "I was going to make eggs for you, but I was scared to turn the stove on." Marissa knelt and hugged him, pressing a kiss to his forehead. The scent of cheap soap and old notebook paper clung to him, and it filled her throat with an ache she couldn't name. "That's okay, baby. I brought home some bread. We'll have it with peanut butter." She didn't tell him what had happened. Jacob was only 10, but he was sensitive enough to know when something was wrong. She moved into the kitchen and opened the fridge. Inside, there was a nearly expired carton of milk, a single wrinkled apple, and a jar of peanut butter scraped down to its last spoonful. Her paycheck for the week had been set aside to cover the electric bill and buy books for Jacob's new semester. But now, with the suspension hanging over her, she didn't know when she'd see another dollar. She put together a simple breakfast, 2 slices of toast and half the apple cut into thin wedges. Jacob munched cheerfully, talking about his art class, a math problem he had gotten wrong, and how his teacher had praised him for trying. Marissa smiled and nodded, listening, holding on to the sound of his voice like a thread keeping her from unraveling. But her mind kept drifting back to the images from earlier that morning. The cold, echoing boardroom. Graham Whitaker's colorless face, Michael Langston's eyes sharp with disdain, and the murmurs behind her back, each one like a needle. When Jacob left for school, Marissa busied herself with laundry dishes and wiping down the floor, trying to keep her hands moving, trying not to let her thoughts wander too far ahead. But no matter how she scrubbed or folded, the feeling persisted. Something had shifted. A door had slammed shut behind her, and she had no idea which one, if any, would ever open again. Around noon, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. No voicemail. Minutes later, a text appeared, curt and bloodless, from the company's human resources system. "The temporary suspension decision is still under review. No further details at this time." Marissa stood in the living room, eyes resting on the wall calendar where each square had been marked in pencil: parent-teacher conference, rent due, water bill payment. Each little box felt heavier than the last. She pulled out her wallet and counted the cash she had left. $65. She sat down and opened her battered old laptop, searching for part-time jobs. Most listings were for full-time roles or came with fine print requiring a clean employment history, no suspensions, no red flags. She closed the laptop with a quiet sigh. Outside, the sky had shifted, the cold creeping back with sharper edges. The old radiator let out a steady hiss, its heat as weak and uncertain as the final breath of winter. Marissa pulled a thin blanket around herself and curled up on the sofa, arms wrapped tightly around her slender frame. Beyond the window, the city moved forward without pause, a stream of lives and deadlines and destinations. But inside this small apartment, time felt frozen in place. Tonight she would tell Jacob that Mommy was just taking a few days off, that everything would be fine, that there was nothing to worry about. And Jacob would believe her, because he always had, because to him his mother was someone strong enough to stand against the world. But Marissa knew the truth. From today on, that world would not be the same, and she wasn't sure if she had the strength to start again. 3 days after the incident on the 37th floor, a thick envelope appeared beneath her front door. She found it in the pale light of early morning while she was making breakfast for Jacob: burnt toast and the last half of a banana from the kitchen. The envelope bore the Whitaker and Company logo printed in cold black ink above a line of text that struck like a blow: notice of employment termination. Marissa opened it with trembling fingers, though some part of her had already known what it would say. Still, nothing could have prepared her for the way each sentence landed with clinical precision, stripped of warmth or regret. Termination reason: conduct inconsistent with professional standards. Violation of personal boundary protocols involving senior executive staff during a sensitive incident. Effective immediately. No further explanation, no chance to respond, no call from human resources. Just silence and an end. Marissa set the letter on the table feeling hollow and stepped toward the door, trying to steady her breath when her phone rang with Carla's name glowing across the screen, a former coworker from the night shift. She answered with a rough whisper, and Carla's voice came shaky, asking if she was all right, and Marissa said she thought so, though she barely believed her own words. Then Carla asked if she had seen it, and when Marissa asked what Carla told her, there was a clip circulating online cut from the security footage that day, showing only the moment Marissa leaned down toward Graham Whitaker, and someone had stamped a headline over it, calling her a single mother, kissing an unconscious chief executive in a boardroom, a line that left Marissa frozen in place as Carla went on in a hushed tone, as if afraid to hear her own story, describing the comments that were vicious and multiplying to calling Marissa an opportunist, a woman inventing drama to get close to the wealthy. Strangers digging up old public records about her overdue rent notices and the semester she never finished at community college, stitching together a false portrait from scraps that had nothing to do with who she was. Marissa sank into a chair, heart pounding, opened her phone and typed her own name, watching page after page bloom with tabloids flashing lurid headlines and anonymous accounts sharing a blurry still image of her bent over Whitaker's face, a single frame torn from a chain of life-saving actions, now twisted into proof that she had violated a helpless man, while others wrote that she was a desperate woman trying to seize attention. And one account even posted her address, asking whether someone like her should ever have worked in a building meant for the elite. Marissa set the phone aside as a wave of humiliation rolled through her, deeper than anything she had ever felt. Realizing she had not only lost her job, but was having her dignity stripped away in public by people who had never heard her voice or cared for the truth. Later that afternoon, when she went to the corner store to buy milk for Jacob, she felt the shift in the shopkeeper's eyes, once warm, now cautious, and two teenagers by the refrigerator snickered when she turned her head, one whispering that she was the woman from the video, and Marissa lowered her gaze and quickened her pace, wanting to shout, to explain, to tell them they were wrong, that she had only tried to save a life, that she had done nothing dishonorable. But she knew that in this world, when a poor woman lays her hands on a powerful man, no one starts by asking why, they simply decide what kind of person she must be. That night, Marissa said nothing to Jacob. He finished his homework, climbed into bed early, and curled up beside the worn-out teddy bear she had given him back when he was still in preschool. Just before falling asleep, he asked quietly, "Are you going back to work tomorrow, Mom?" She smiled, a thin, fragile smile, stretched like thread. "Not yet, sweetheart. I'm taking a little break." Jacob nodded, accepting the answer without pushing. He always did. After he drifted off, Marissa sat alone by the window, the dull glow of the street lamp casting a soft, tired light across her face. Outside, the world went on spinning, judging, concluding, whispering. And she, the woman who had placed her hands on a lifeless chest and fought to bring it back to life, was slowly vanishing under the weight of those whispers. And something inside her began to die that night too, not hope, not even courage, but the quiet belief that doing the right thing would mean someone somewhere would protect you, because she had done the right thing, and that very act was now unraveling her life. 1 week after receiving her termination letter, Marissa Lane's name had moved beyond social media posts and started slipping into the morning news cycle. She didn't watch, but her neighbors did, and they didn't hesitate to repeat what they'd heard. A local news segment played the now infamous surveillance footage, crudely cropped and looped, showing her leaning down to administer CPR. But the footage had been shortened, the context trimmed away, and a calm, dispassionate voice narrated over it, describing an inappropriate interaction between a lower-level employee and a chief executive during a medically unconfirmed incident. There was no mention of his breath stopping, no acknowledgement that she had acted when everyone else had frozen. Worse still were the tabloid-style sites that pounced like scavengers. One headline screamed, "Single mother tries to kiss her way to a better life with unconscious billionaire." Another site dug up fragments of her past and laid them bare, a screenshot of a public food assistance record, a filing for personal bankruptcy from 4 years ago, a college transcript showing she had dropped out of community college. They didn't care about the truth. They were too busy crafting the perfect target for public scorn, a poor woman alone, undereducated, grasping for attention, trying to use a fleeting moment to claw her way into a life that didn't belong to her. And so piece by piece, they built her into a caricature, not someone real, not someone worth listening to, just a symbol shaped for ridicule. Marissa avoided leaving the house unless it was absolutely necessary. Even the places that had once felt familiar now seemed to turn their backs. The laundromat down the block where she used to be allowed to run a small tab until payday suddenly refused the owner, mumbling something about needing to keep things in order. Her landlord knocked 3 times that week, asking if she could pay next month's rent early, said he'd heard she might be having trouble. And on the walk to Jacob's school, she could feel the weight of eyes. Some people looked away. Others looked straight at her, but not with warmth. Even Jacob could sense something had shifted. One afternoon he came home different, quiet. He sat at the table without a word. "Did something happen at school, sweetheart?" Marissa asked gently. Jacob stared down into his bowl, spinning the spoon around in his soup. "A kid said you were on TV, said you kissed a man for money." Marissa felt her heart twist in her chest, a deep, slow pain she couldn't show. She stood and walked to the window, blinking away the sting in her eyes. "I don't believe them," Jacob added, his voice small but sure. "I know my mom is good." She turned, nodding, forcing a smile. "Thank you, baby." But in her heart she knew not every child would hold on to that kind of faith, not when the same lies were told over and over, polished into something that looked like truth. The food in the kitchen was dwindling. Her savings were gone. She had called 3 places about hourly work, waitressing, dishwashing, anything, but as soon as they looked her up online, the answer was always the same. "We'll review your application and get back to you." No one ever did. She had once believed that if she kept her head down long enough, if she stayed quiet, the storm would pass. But each day the story only spread wider. A new post on a respected financial blog stirred fresh outrage. Gaps in corporate security allow unqualified individuals access to senior executives. The article never used her name, just referred to her as that woman. And below, hundreds of comments poured in, sarcastic, judgmental, cruel. They didn't ask what really happened. They didn't wonder who she was. They talked about her like she was a cautionary tale, like a scandal to be passed around, like a warning label. Not a person who once knelt beside a dying man and gave him her breath. On a cold, rain-swept night, Marissa received an anonymous message. Just one line, stripped of context or mercy. "If you know what's good for you, get out of this city." She slid down to the floor, back against the wall, the dim glow of a bedside lamp casting long shadows across the room. Alone. Silence settled over her like a second skin. She thought about calling a newspaper, a journalist, anyone who might still believe in the truth. She imagined herself telling the real story, explaining what had happened, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that she had tried to save a man's life. But would anyone care enough to listen? And if they did, would they believe her? She started to doubt even herself. She had done the right thing. She had kept a man alive, and yet the world was treating her like a criminal. As night fell deeper, Marissa lay curled on the sofa, clutching the fraying edges of an old blanket. Jacob was asleep in the next room, his breathing soft and even. Outside, the wind lashed against the windows like a voice trying to claw its way in. Each gust whispered the same aching question she couldn't shake. In a world like this, does decency still matter? Or does doing the right thing at the wrong time turn you into a villain before you're ever given the chance to be heard? High above the city, on the top floor of Chicago Central Hospital, the lights glowed soft behind pale curtains. Machines hummed steadily in the sterile stillness, and in the quiet of his room, surrounded by the clean scent of antiseptic and the muted shuffle of nurses' feet, Graham Whitaker lay motionless. It had been more than a week since he collapsed in the boardroom. The incident had been kept internal, brushed off in the official reports as a minor cardiac event. He was recovering, they said, stable, no longer in danger. But what no one knew was that ever since that moment, Graham had been dreaming the same dream over and over again. In the dream, he was no longer a powerful executive standing above a polished conference table. He was falling, sinking into a vast, cold darkness, deep and silent as the ocean floor. His heart slowed the rhythm, fading like footsteps down a hallway he couldn't see. And in that darkness, just before the final silence took him, he heard a voice, not loud but startlingly clear. "Don't die, please, don't die here." It was a woman's voice, but not one he recognized from his boardroom or any of the steel-tipped meetings he was used to. It wasn't sharp or authoritative. It didn't speak of shares or leverage or quarterly returns. It trembled, slightly urgent and human, threaded with fear, and something more profound, something that reached into him. And after that, he had taken a breath. He lived. Graham jolted awake in the middle of the night, staring up at the sterile white ceiling. the steady beep of the heart monitor filling the room like a distant metronome counting borrowed time. He lay motionless, eyes wide, cold sweat soaking into the sheets beneath him. He brought a trembling hand to his chest. His heart was still there, strong, alive. But that voice hadn't left him. It echoed inside his skull, weaving through his waking thoughts and folding itself into his dreams. The next morning, the head nurse entered his room with a practiced smile, recorded his vitals, and wished him a pleasant day. Graham said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on the snow, gently falling outside the window, layering the city he once thought he understood. He couldn't recall all of what had happened that day in the boardroom. They told him he had collapsed without warning, a sudden episode caused by an irregular heartbeat. They said the medics arrived quickly, but Graham knew there was a hole in his memory, a deep blank space that no medical report or assistant's explanation could fill. And then came the next dream. "I know, Seep." A different tone, now firmer, laced with urgency. "I have to do this. No one else will." He felt hands pressing against his chest. Not imagined. Real. So real that he woke with a start, heart pounding wildly. This time, sleep didn't return. He asked his assistant for the full surveillance footage from the incident every second from the moment he fell. But the reply came curt. The footage had been secured for internal investigation, inaccessible even to him. A sharp pang cut through him. He was the CEO, the man whose name crowned the building, and yet they had denied him access to the moment he nearly died. That was when the questions began to form. Who had saved him? Why was that voice missing from every report? Why had no one mentioned the person who kept his heart beating long enough for help to arrive? The dream came again and again. Each time the voice grew clearer, and then on the fourth night it finally said a name. "Marissa, my name is Marissa." Graham sat bolt upright, fingers clutching the sheets, breath caught in his throat. He had never heard that name in any meeting. Not among the board members, not in the executive team, not in any of the formal debriefings about that day. And yet it was her, Marissa. His heart was still beating because of her. And he knew with absolute clarity that if he didn't find her, if he didn't bring the truth of what she had done into the light, then he didn't deserve a single second more of the life she had given back to him. 2 days after the final dream, Graham Whitaker summoned his personal assistant to the hospital at 7 in the morning, before the sun had risen above the skyline, and while snow still clung thick to the outside of the window panes. He was sitting upright in bed, not with the fragility of a man recovering from cardiac arrest, but with the presence of someone regaining command. His eyes were locked on the television mounted high on the wall, though he wasn't watching it. He was waiting for something clearer than memory. "I need to see the security footage from that day," he said firmly, his voice carrying the old authority that once filled boardrooms. Thomas, his assistant, hesitated. "Sir, you know HR already." "I don't need a reason," Graham cut in. "I went into cardiac arrest. I have a right to know who brought me back." Thomas nodded, recognizing the tone. He stepped out and made a call. An hour later, a technician arrived, discreet and quiet, carrying a small external hard drive and a company-issued laptop pre-cleared with internal access codes. They plugged it in, navigated to the surveillance files from the quarterly meeting 37th floor boardroom, time-stamped between 9 o'clock and 10:30. Graham sat motionless, eyes locked on the screen. There he was, standing at the head of the table, laser pointer in hand, gesturing to a digital chart. He looked composed, commanding the image of control. Then it happened. A tiny pause, almost imperceptible. His hand drifted to his chest. His frame shifted slightly. He tilted forward. And then he collapsed. The silence that followed was louder than any alarm. No one moved. The heads exchanged looks, wide-eyed, frozen, their suits crisp, their bodies inert. A woman shouted something unintelligible. A man took a step back, pulling out his phone but not dialing. They were watching him die, and doing nothing. A few seconds later, the boardroom doors burst open. A woman rushed in, Marissa. Graham recognized her instantly. Petite frame, hair pulled back, dark blue uniform, unmistakable. She dropped to her knees beside his collapsed body, checked for a response, and then began CPR. Every motion was precise, practiced. Someone tried to stop her, but she didn't waver. She kept going. Graham's hand tightened around the armrest of his hospital chair as he watched himself gasp back to life in the footage, his chest rising under the force of her compressions. Marissa leaned back just as the building's security arrived, stepping aside without hesitation. Then came the moment he hadn't remembered but now would never forget. Michael Langston stormed into frame, his face pinched with contempt. He said something to her. The footage had no audio, but Graham didn't need sound to understand. It was a reprimand, a dismissal. Marissa stood up, She was led out of the room like an intruder. No one handed her water, no one thanked her, no one even looked her in the eye. Graham leaned back, his heart pounding. The video ended. The screen went dark. In the quiet that followed, only the faint pulse of the heart monitor filled the room. "Who is she?" he asked, eyes still fixed on the black screen. Thomas opened a thin folder. Marissa Lane, night shift cleaning staff, not a full employee, contracted through a third party, terminated last week. Why? The legal and PR teams were concerned about optics. There's a leaked video. Someone cut a clip from the surveillance footage. It shows her leaning close to your face while you were unconscious. Online people misunderstood. Misunderstood, Graham repeated, his voice like ice. She saved my life. We tried to keep the situation quiet, sir. Avoid any unnecessary... I want a meeting with everyone involved in her dismissal, Graham said, rising to his feet against medical advice, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. And I want Marissa Lane found. Thomas hesitated, then gave a single nod. I'll arrange it. Once the room emptied, Graham turned back to the laptop, its screen now dark but still warm. The voice he'd heard in his dreams echoed louder than ever. Now it had a face, a name, and a truth that refused to be buried. He, Graham Whitaker, the man who had built empires by predicting every risk, managing every variable, had just been humbled by something he had never accounted for. A woman. No one in that boardroom knew a woman with no title, no power, and no protection had done what none of them had the courage to do, and for that she had been cast out. He knew then what he had to do, not for optics, not for corporate responsibility, but for something more elemental. Because justice, real justice, demands that someone stand up for the heart that dared to beat when the world stood still. 2 days after being discharged from the hospital, Graham Whitaker returned to the headquarters of Whitaker and Company, for the first time since the heart failure that nearly ended his life. He was no longer the weary man lying under pale hospital lights. He walked through the grand marble lobby with steady steps, dressed in a dark buttoned-up suit, his expression cold, unreadable. People glanced at him, but no one dared speak. They didn't know what was waiting behind the closed doors of the meeting room on the 18th floor, but everyone sensed something had shifted. The room wasn't one of the company's grand strategic halls, just a smaller, more private space where internal meetings between HR and legal typically took place. When Graham entered, 3 people stood. Michael Langston sat at the head of the table, flanked by Denise, the head of human resources, and Keller, the company's lead counsel. No one smiled. No one welcomed him back. Graham didn't care. I want to speak, he said, placing a folder firmly on the table about the termination of Ms. Marissa Lane. Denise Ever, the diplomat, spoke in her usual gentle tone, trying to smooth the air. Mr. Whitaker, the decision was based on a careful assessment of media risk and the company's brand image. We believed. She saved my life, Graham interrupted, his gaze fixed squarely on Michael Langston. And you repaid her by dragging her name through the mud and throwing her out into the street. Michael leaned back, his voice calm, but tinged with discomfort. I understand you feel grateful, but we had to protect the company's reputation. The video spread without context. The public reaction was harsh, and if we hadn't acted quickly, we could have faced a full-blown PR crisis. And your response, Graham said, his tone low, sharp as a blade, was to erase the only person who moved when I collapsed in front of all of you. She's not a communications professional, he continued. She's a janitor. She wasn't trained to navigate a media storm. She was trained to clean floors. But when it mattered, when my life was slipping away, she didn't freeze. She didn't wait for permission. She acted. And she chose my life over the company's image. Keller stepped in, trying to restore balance. We're not denying Ms. Lane's actions were meaningful, but company protocol exists for a reason. She wasn't authorized to enter the room. Physical contact with an unconscious executive presents legal risks. And what about the ethical risk, Graham cut in, of staying silent in the face of courage? What about the cost of allowing a woman's name to be destroyed while we sit in comfort discussing optics? Silence settled like fog. Then Graham stood, pulled out a stack of papers. I want the disciplinary decision revoked. All of it. I want a public statement issued, a formal acknowledgement that Marissa Lane saved my life. And I want her found. Now. Denise blinked, visibly thrown. Sir, we no longer have contact with Ms. Lane. Her company email was deactivated. She hasn't responded to any post-termination communication. Then find another way, Graham said. Hire an investigator. Call every number in her file. I don't care what it takes. I will not sit by while the only person who acted when I was dying is turned into a villain, while the rest of you discuss brand protection in air-conditioned rooms. Michael, for the first time, let irritation slip into his voice. You're letting personal feelings influence company decisions. This could backfire. Graham met his eyes without flinching. I've run this company on logic for 30 years, and it almost killed me. From now on, I'm going to run it with a conscience. The words dropped into the room like a hammer. Denise had nothing to say. Michael looked away. Graham gathered his papers, left the room like a winter wind cutting through the halls. No one stopped him. In the elevator, he pulled out his phone and typed the name that had haunted his dreams. Marissa Lane. A name no one in the system remembered, but to him it was the reason he was still standing. And he knew one thing for certain: not everyone has the courage to save a life while an entire room stands silent. But now it was his turn to break that silence. When the black Lincoln pulled to a stop along the frost-covered curb in Chicago's South Side, Graham Whitaker looked out through the window and felt something sink in his chest. The buildings were old brick stained and weather-beaten. Walls covered in graffiti, metal doors, dented and scratched rusted staircases clinging to the sides like broken ribs. This wasn't a place he'd ever imagined someone like Marissa Lane would call home. But the address extracted from a human resources file after nearly a week of relentless insistence had led him here. A third-floor apartment in a building with no elevator, no doorman, no welcome. He stepped out into the cold. The wind cut across his face like broken glass shrieking between the cracks of this forgotten part of the city. Each step up the iron stairs groaned beneath him, the sound echoing like the memory of something long neglected. At the door marked number 6, Graham paused. No television sounds, no footsteps. He knocked 3 times. No answer. He knocked again, louder. This time there was a faint clatter from inside. The door cracked open just an inch. A boy peered out, thin, hair unkempt, eyes cautious. "You must be Jacob Graham," said, softening his voice. The boy nodded slowly, studying the man before him from head to toe, as if trying to figure out what kind of person would come here dressed like that. "Is your mother home?" Graham asked. "I'd like to speak with her." Jacob hesitated, then opened the door a little wider. "She's sleeping. She's had a fever for a few days. I was making soup. I was going to call someone soon." Graham stepped inside. The apartment was small, bare, with the kind of quiet that clings when someone's been sick for too long. A hot plate on the counter was simmering something faintly sweet, but the scent couldn't overpower the dampness, the stale air, the sharp edge of cold medicine. On a worn-out sofa, Marissa lay curled beneath a thin blanket. Her face pale, lips slightly parted with short, shallow breaths. A cloth rested on her forehead, damp but already cooling. Graham moved toward her quickly and knelt. "Marissa," he called. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Who is it?" "It's me, Graham Whitaker. I came to thank you." She didn't respond. Her eyelids drooped again, heavy with exhaustion and fever. Graham turned sharply to Jacob. "Did you call a doctor?" Jacob shook his head. "I didn't know who to call. She said she'd be okay, but she's been asleep for 2 days now." Without hesitation, Graham pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. His voice was clear, sharp, decisive. He gave the address, described her condition, and demanded an ambulance immediately. Because this time, he wasn't going to wait for someone else to act. After ending the call, Graham stepped out onto the narrow balcony, drawing in a sharp breath. The cold air slapped against his face, but it didn't soothe the fury rising in his chest. Fury at the people who had done this to her, fury at the system that had abandoned a woman simply because she was poor, and fury at himself for having stayed silent for far too long. When he returned inside, Jacob was sitting beside his mother, holding her hand. His eyes were wide, but he didn't cry. He was a child who had learned to be brave too early. Graham sat down next to him. "You've done very well," he said quietly. "But this time it's okay to let the grown-ups take care of it." The window rattled with wind. In the distance, the faint wail of sirens began to grow. And in that small, dim room, in the heart of a frozen winter, a man who had once commanded boardrooms and shaped markets bowed his head for the first time, not in defeat, but in reverence before the quiet devastation of poverty and illness. He had come to say thank you, but now he understood gratitude wasn't enough. He owed her more than words, and he would begin repaying that debt by making sure she would not fight alone any longer. Marissa Lane was admitted to the emergency room at St. Agnes Hospital just before 9 o'clock that night, as thick snow began to fall over the darkened streets of South Chicago. She was diagnosed with severe pneumonia complicated by hypothermia and exhaustion. As doctors and nurses worked swiftly around her, Graham Whitaker stood still in the corner, watching, feeling helpless. For the first time in decades, a man who had always been able to command outcomes now powerless before the fragility of the human body. He couldn't order her lungs to recover, couldn't negotiate her temperature back to normal. All he could do was wait. And this time, he wasn't the one being saved. He was the one praying that another heart wouldn't stop beating. 3 hours later, Marissa was moved to the intensive care unit. She remained unconscious, but her pulse had stabilized. A nurse told him what she needed most now was rest. Graham didn't leave the hospital. He booked a modest hotel room across the street, but he spent most of his time in the hospital room, seated beside her bed, his hand resting lightly on the edge of her blanket, his eyes drifting occasionally to the blinking monitor beside her. By morning, pale sunlight filtered through the window. Marissa stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open slowly, every movement draining what little strength she had. She turned her head, blinking, and saw him still there, still waiting. What are you doing here?" Her voice was thin, hoarse, as if unsure it had the right to speak. Graham smiled gently and nodded. "This time it's my turn to save you." Marissa frowned faintly, trying to make sense of the words. I don't need saving. You need rest, and Jacob needs his mother. I've spoken with the doctors. They said if you hadn't been brought in last night, things could have ended very differently." She turned her face away, her gaze drifting into the empty space between them. She didn't ask how he found her, didn't ask why he came. Maybe in the depths of loneliness she'd stopped expecting answers. Graham sat in silence for a moment, then said, his voice low, steady, "You know, I was lying in this hospital a few floors up just a week ago. I thought I'd reached the end. And the only thing I remember from that moment wasn't my stock portfolio or my executive calendar. It was a voice, a woman's voice saying, 'Don't die.' That was you." Marissa closed her eyes and the tears came. Not from emotion, but from exhaustion, from the long ache of not being seen. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. "I just couldn't watch you die, that's all." Graham nodded. "And I can't keep living like that never happened." They said nothing more. They didn't need to. His presence at her side was enough to start undoing the loneliness she had carried for so long. Later that morning, a nurse brought Jacob into the room. He ran to his mother, wrapping his arms around her thin arm, burying his face. Marissa gave him a faint smile, stroking his hair with trembling fingers. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I ate soup and went to bed on time," Jacob replied quickly. "Mr. Graham stayed with me. I told him everything." Marissa looked over at Graham. He simply shrugged. "He's very smart and very brave, just like his mom." In the quiet white room, there were no ceremonies, no applause, no headlines. Just 3 people, each carrying wounds of their own, beginning for the first time to feel like they weren't alone anymore. And for Graham, it was the first time he truly understood that sometimes gratitude isn't about obligation. It's about redemption. A way to answer silence with action, a way to say, "I see you, I believe you, I will stand beside you." And in that moment, watching her rest, he knew he had never seen anyone more courageous than the woman lying in that hospital bed. 3 days after Marissa Lane regained consciousness and could finally sit up on her own, Graham Whitaker stepped onto a modest stage set in the central atrium of Whitaker and Company's headquarters, a space where he had once hosted press briefings about billion-dollar acquisitions and sweeping global strategies. But this time the audience wasn't shareholders or Wall Street analysts. It was local journalists, curious employees lining the first-floor balconies, and millions more watching a live stream across social media platforms. Behind him, there was no grand branding, no company slogan stretching across the backdrop. Just a plain white screen with the company's logo placed small and discreet in the bottom corner. Graham stood alone behind the podium. No PR team, no legal counsel flanking him. He didn't need them, not this time. He opened a folder, glanced at its contents briefly out of habit, then set it aside. He would not read from prepared notes. He would speak from somewhere deeper. "My name is Graham Whitaker." He began, his voice ringing steady and clear through the vaulted space. "I'm the chief executive officer of this company, and I'm standing here today not to talk about profits or expansion strategies, but to talk about the truth." He paused, locking his gaze on the camera lens. 2 weeks ago, during an internal meeting, I stopped breathing. You've likely read the headlines, watched the videos, heard the speculation about what happened next. But what most of you haven't been told is that I was brought back to life by a woman named Marissa Lane, a janitor, a single mother, someone who was not invited into that room, someone we tried to erase from this story. He drew in a breath as though shedding a weight that had sat on his shoulders for far too long. We failed, not in quarterly returns or market share. We failed in our humanity. Instead of honoring her act of courage, this company fired Marissa Lane, denied responsibility, and allowed her to become the target of ridicule from the media, from the internet, and even from the very people who once worked beside her. A hush spread across the room. Some in the crowd looked down. Others turned to each other, faces tight with discomfort. I'm standing here to say it plainly: that decision was wrong, and I bear ultimate responsibility for it. I offer a public apology to Marissa Lane, to her son, and to anyone who still believes that justice matters. We are correcting that wrong. He held up a document. This is a formal reversal of all disciplinary action taken against Ms. Lane. We have submitted takedown requests to media platforms for all false or defamatory content. In addition, the company is assuming full responsibility for her medical care, her recovery, and is providing direct support to help her secure housing and regain stability. This is not a gift. This is the bare minimum of what we owe her. He let the silence settle for a beat, not for drama, but for the truth to have room to land. This company has built its reputation on leadership and integrity, he continued. But integrity means nothing if it disappears when it is most needed. Marissa Lane acted with more courage and clarity than anyone else in that room, including me. And if this company is to have any future worth building, we must learn to see people like her, to protect them, to honor them. Not only when it's easy, especially when it's not. He stepped back from the podium, his words still echoing in the stillness. There was no applause, not yet, just a silence that for the first time felt honest, a silence that said the message had been heard. And far from the glare of the cameras, in a quiet hospital room across town, a woman who had once knelt on the floor to save a life without asking for recognition, without waiting for thanks, would finally be seen. At the back of the hall, someone began to clap. It started softly, a lone sound echoing through the vast room. Then another joined, and another, until a rising wave of applause spread through the crowd, not rehearsed, not for show, but raw and rising from those who moments earlier had merely been passive observers. Now they stood as witnesses to something rare, an act of public reckoning and of justice long delayed. Graham waited for the clapping to subside. Then he spoke once more, his voice lower, steadier. But everything I've said today, it still won't give Marissa Lane back what she's lost. It won't erase the sleepless nights, the suspicious stares, the innocent questions from a child who just wanted to protect his mother. And that is why I want to say one last thing. She is my hero. With that, he stepped down from the podium. He didn't stay for photos. He didn't take questions from the press. Everything he needed to say had been said, and for the first time in many years, Graham Whitaker didn't feel like a CEO delivering a statement. He felt like a man finally fully doing the right thing. In a hospital room across the city, Marissa sat on the edge of her bed watching the broadcast from a small wall-mounted screen. She held Jacob's hand in hers, tears clouding her eyes, not because he had cleared her name, but because after everything, someone had believed her. And that belief, that simple, powerful belief in the truth, had finally been heard. 1 week after the press conference that rippled across media and rewrote the narrative, Marissa Lane stood by the window of her new apartment, quietly watching the melting snow of early spring swirl across the park below. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a small building in Lincoln Park, quiet, clean, bathed in soft sunlight filtering through tall windows. The walls were painted a warm, creamy beige. The floors gleamed. In the kitchen, a small pot of Jacob's favorite chicken soup simmered gently, sending steam curling through the air. All of it still felt foreign. A part of her didn't quite believe it was real. She wasn't the kind of person good things usually happen to. For so many years, everything she touched seemed to break. But now, standing in this warm, quiet space for the first time in her life, Marissa felt like she could breathe. That morning, Jacob woke up early, running through the apartment as if discovering a new world. He touched everything, the soft couch cushions, the empty bookshelf, then stopped by the window, pointing down at the playground below. "Mom, there's a real swing set, not the broken one like before." Marissa smiled and walked over, brushing his hair gently. "Yes, sweetheart, this is our new place, and we're starting fresh here." The company had taken care of everything, the move, the furnishings, the school enrollment. They'd even handed her a bank card with enough to get by for the next few months. But what lingered with her most wasn't the new space or the financial support. It was the envelope, a personal letter handwritten by Graham himself. Just a few lines. "Yet, opportunities come in strange forms. Don't turn one away just because it feels unfamiliar. When you're ready, come find me, not as someone I owe, but as someone I believe can do more than she ever thought possible. Marissa had read that letter over and over the night it arrived. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside her bed. It was strange, almost surreal. The man who had never noticed her presence as she scrubbed the floor beneath his chair now sent her a message of genuine respect and invitation. She didn't know what she had to offer. She wasn't anyone important. She cleaned, she cooked, she saved where she could. But maybe, just maybe, life didn't always pick people for their titles. Maybe it picked them in moments, small ones, raw ones, when courage rose, even if no one was looking. And maybe, just maybe, this was her moment. That afternoon, Marissa and Jacob stood together by the living room window, hanging a thin curtain across the glass. The fabric fluttered slightly in the breeze, and when the sun slipped through it, soft streaks of light danced across the floor like spilled gold. "Mom, we have a rainbow now," Jacob said, grinning. Marissa sat beside him, pulling him gently into her arms. "Yes," she whispered, "and this time we're not letting anyone take it away." No more sideways glances, no more whispers behind her back. Marissa had stepped out from the shadow others tried to bury her in, and here, in this small apartment on a quiet street, she began to understand something that had always felt out of reach, that sometimes the miraculous doesn't arrive like thunder in a clear sky, but like pale spring sunlight, slow, warm, and unshakably steady. A new life had begun, and with it an opportunity she had never dared to imagine waited just ahead. That morning, after walking Jacob to his new school and returning home, Marissa sat on the sofa sipping a warm cup of tea when her phone rang. The screen lit up with a name she recognized, Graham Whitaker. She hesitated before answering. Since moving into her new home, he had kept in touch, short letters, kind messages asking about her health, Jacob's schooling. But this was the first time he had called. His voice was as calm and steady as always, but there was a certain formality to it today. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I'm downstairs. If you have a moment, I'd like to take you to breakfast. There's something I'd like to talk about." Marissa blinked. "You're downstairs at my building." "Just outside," he replied. "I thought it would be better in person." An hour later, they were seated across from each other at a small cafe just a few blocks from her apartment. Graham ordered toast and black coffee. Marissa chose oatmeal, simple, familiar. At first, the conversation was tentative, but Graham, always purposeful, soon got to the point. "I'm rebuilding the company's employee welfare program," he said, "and I don't mean just a few upgraded benefits or free fruit in the break room. I want to start over, build something real, a system that sees the people who are too often unseen, from the corner offices down to the janitorial staff. And I don't want people designing it who've never lived it." Marissa lowered her spoon, brow furrowed. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Graham looked at her, his gaze steady without a trace of condescension. "Only trust. I want you to lead it. I want you to be our head of employee well-being initiatives. The title isn't what matters, the role is. You'll shape it, guide it, inspire it, because you know better than anyone what people like you have always needed and never had." Marissa froze. She had once scrubbed those halls on hands and knees, ignored, passed over like background noise. And now the man at the top of it all sat before her, speaking to her with a respect and belief she had never expected to receive from anyone, let alone him. "You're sure?" she asked softly. "I never finished college. I've never managed anyone. I don't have the right qualifications." "You've led your life," Graham said. "You raised a child to be kind and brave. You stood your ground in silence and saved my life while a room full of leaders watched. That's enough." Marissa turned toward the window. Outside, melting snow floated down onto damp pavement, slow and silent. A part of her wanted to say no, fear still loud in her bones, fear of failing, of not being enough, but another part, deeper, stronger, told her this wasn't just a chance for herself. This was a chance to change something for others like her. She looked back at Graham, steadying her breath. "I'll try," she said, "but I won't promise I'll get it right the first time." Graham smiled, nodding. "You don't have to get it right at the start. You just have to remember why you started." And so it was that Marissa Lane, once cast out for daring to act at the right moment, now stepped across a threshold into a world where she had never been invited, not as the outsider wiping the floor clean after hours, but as someone walking directly into the center, intending to change it from within. On the first morning, Marissa Lane entered the headquarters of Whitaker and Company. In her entirely new role, no one looked at her as the night shift janitor anymore. She was no longer in that faded blue uniform, no longer carrying a mop or a bucket of cleaning supplies. This time she carried a small leather bag, wore low-heeled shoes, and a light gray trench coat, her hair neatly pinned up. Yet the thing that felt strangest to her wasn't the clothing or the shift in how the receptionist now glanced her way, but the quiet, uncanny silence that seemed to cling to the very walls she had once known so well. Her office was a small one on the 12th floor, only a few rooms away from the executive suite. The space was tidy with a brand new desk, a computer monitor, a leather-upholstered chair, and a large window overlooking the heart of the city. Marissa stood at that window, gazing down at the street where she had once walked each evening in the dark, when the cold crept up her fingers until she could no longer feel them. Now, just a few stories above, the world felt completely reversed, but it was this swift reversal that left her breath catching in her chest. All morning she sat through internal briefings, met the human resources team, the people assigned to work with her on rebuilding the company's employee benefits program. A few shook her hand with genuine warmth. Others smiled with polite restraint, their eyes unable to hide the uncertainty. Some avoided her gaze altogether when her new title was mentioned. There were whispers behind her as she passed through corridors, and Marissa felt it clearly, like a shift in the air before a storm. Her presence unsettled the place. She was the embodiment of a mistake the company had once tried to bury. And now, even though she had been appointed by the CEO himself, she remained a stranger, stepping into a house that had never been meant for her. At midday, as she sat alone in the management break room, eating her lunch in silence, Marissa happened to see a former coworker from her night shift days. Their eyes met for only a few seconds before the other person lowered their gaze and quietly walked away. The feeling of isolation did not come from any one overt act, but from the empty spaces between glances, from the words that rose halfway to the lips before being swallowed back down. That afternoon, Marissa had a private meeting with Denise, the head of human resources, who had once been part of the committee that signed off on her dismissal. Denise maintained a professional tone, offered polite smiles, and presented a series of charts and reports outlining the current state of internal policy. Marissa listened and took notes. But deep down, an unease settled in her chest, because beneath those numbers lay a system that had once marked her as a threat to be removed. And now that very same system regarded her as an unpredictable variable. That evening, back in their new apartment, Marissa watched Jacob doing his homework at the dining table. The boy beamed with excitement, chatting about a new friend he had made, about the school library that had modern computers and a soccer field he had yet to explore. Marissa smiled and nodded, but inside her there was a hollow that had no name. She had grown used to being underestimated, used to the silence society offered when people like her fell. But she had never imagined that stepping into a role with real influence could feel so achingly lonely. Late that night, Graham sent a message, just one simple line. The first day is always the hardest. They don't need to believe in you yet. They just need to see that you won't quit. Marissa read the words over and over. Then she turned off the light, lay down next to her son, and pulled the blanket up to their shoulders. The room was quiet, but inside her old sounds stirred again, like wounds that had not fully healed. She did not know how far she could go, but the one thing she did know was this: tomorrow she would return, and that was the first step. One Thursday afternoon, as the late sun streamed through the glass of the 12th floor conference room, Marissa Lane stood in front of the whiteboard, marker in hand, her heart pounding hard with each beat. In front of her sat 6 people, most of them dressed in polished suits, their eyes fixed on her with a blend of doubt and anticipation. They represented key departments: finance, human resources, legal, and internal communications. And they were here for her for the very first presentation of the new employee benefits initiative she had been tasked with launching. Marissa drew in a deep breath, turned around slowly, her hand trembling ever so slightly. Then she began. I know when people hear the word benefits, the first things that come to mind are free fruit gym memberships or expanded health insurance. But for me, benefits don't begin there. They begin with a more basic question. What does a worker need to survive and not break down every single day? She turned to the board and wrote 3 lines in large, deliberate letters. Childcare, rest space, emergency fund. I used to be a single mother working the night shift in this very building. She continued, her voice steadying. I know what it's like to rush home before the sun rises. Pick up your child from a neighbor, then drop him off at school with burning eyes because you haven't slept enough. I know what it's like to fear calling in sick because you'll lose income, to dread leaving early because your pay will be docked, and to never dare dream of someone watching your child while you work." The room fell completely silent. Marissa looked directly at Denise, the woman sitting in the corner who had once signed the termination notice. Denise did not look away, but her eyes were no longer the same. "So the first thing I propose is this," Marissa continued. "A child care center on company grounds, open to the children of all employees, from office staff to logistics workers. Not everyone has family to rely on. Not everyone can afford high-quality daycare. A safe nearby space could take away the greatest daily burden from many lives." She moved to the second point. "Second, we need a real rest area. Not a folding chair and a supply closet, but a quiet space where someone can lie down for a short break, especially those working night shifts or long overtime hours. Exhaustion is not a sign of dedication. It is a sign that the system is crushing the people inside it." Marissa paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "And finally, we need an internal emergency fund. Not predatory loans, not red tape. A fund that can be dispersed quickly when someone faces a crisis, an accident, an illness, a house fire, the death of a loved one. A timely grant, not large but immediate, can be the difference between stability and losing everything." She turned back and placed the marker gently on the table. No one spoke for a moment. Then someone asked, "Do you have the data to back this up?" Marissa nodded and reached for the internal survey she and her small team had conducted over the past 3 weeks. 82% of lower and mid-level employees reported coming to work while ill for fear of losing income. Nearly 70% had no consistent childcare arrangement, and more than half said that if faced with an unexpected emergency, they would not have enough funds to cover a single month's expenses. There was no laughter, no rebuttals. And then, just as the presentation came to an end, Graham stepped quietly into the room. He said nothing. He simply stood near the door, listening to the final words. When Marissa finished, he nodded slowly, his eyes holding a quiet but unmistakable trust. Marissa stepped out of the conference room without expecting applause or praise. She didn't need it. She knew with a quiet certainty that she was no longer the woman who once mopped these floors in silence. But more importantly, she understood that today she had laid the first stone for something truly different. To her, benefits were never about window dressing. They were a company's answer to the deeper question, how do we treat people? And today, at the very least, she had made them begin to ask that question themselves. The rumors began on a Tuesday morning, just as Marissa was setting foot in the office. Denise pulled her aside, her expression more serious than usual. Without much explanation, she handed Marissa a printed page from an anonymous internal blog known for leaking whispers and gossip from inside the corporate world. The headline, bold and harsh, screamed off the page. "A janitor turned head. A benefits program, or just polished PR." Beneath the title stretched a long paragraph laced with mockery, filled with vague accusations about her qualifications, her motives, and the insinuation that her new role was not earned but granted as a favor by Whitaker. Marissa said nothing at first. She laid the page down on the table, her eyes drifting off as though catching the echo of some old sound returning from a far-off place. That familiar feeling, the sting of being doubted, watched, pushed into the corner, came rushing back. Though this time she stood on a different floor, wore different clothes, held a different title. But it wasn't the skepticism that made her blood go cold. It was the name that appeared beneath one of the comments in the thread below that made her tighten her grip. Michael Langston. Edward had once held the title of Executive Vice President until he was quietly forced to step down following Graham's press conference about the night Marissa saved his life. It was Edward who had signed off on her dismissal, not long after the incident, who had once told her in the break room, face expressionless, that the company couldn't afford to let an uncontrollable story damage its image. And now he had returned. Not officially, not with a title, but enough to stir the ashes to try and push her off the path he had once treated like his own private domain. In the days that followed, anonymous emails began to circulate within the company's internal system. Colleagues who had once been warm now grew hesitant, their eyes slipping away in the hallways. Questions began to rise about why Marissa had authority over budgets. A few members of her project team quietly requested transfers to other departments without explanation. She felt it not loud or dramatic, but like a slow change in air pressure, heavy and undeniable. At the end of the week, Graham called her into his office. No pretense, no detours. He laid out several printed pages filled with toxic comments from the internal forum, along with copies of the anonymous messages. He looked her in the eye, his voice even deliberate. "I know where this is coming from, and I'll take care of it. But what I need to ask is this. Do you want to step away?" Marissa was silent for a long while. She turned to the window, watching the city beyond move steadily on, indifferent to the storm rising inside her again. Then she turned back, her eyes calm, more resolute than they had ever been. "I used to have no voice, no right to push back, no one in my corner. But now I do. And if I walk away, just because a few people want me quiet, then I'm handing power back to the very system that once erased me. I won't do that. Not now." Graham nodded once, slowly placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "Good. Then we don't back down." That evening, as Marissa stepped out of the office, a light rain had begun to fall. But within her, there was no trace of fear. She understood now that old shadows always find a way to return, creeping in through cracks when least expected. But she was no longer the solitary woman wandering silent hallways. This time, she had a voice. And more than that, she had learned how to use it, not just to protect herself, but to speak for those who had never been given the chance to speak at all. The gathering took place on a Monday morning in the main hall on the ground floor of the Whitaker and Company headquarters. At first, only a few rows of chairs were filled. People sat apart, their expressions guarded, small groups whispering to one another as if unsure whether to believe in what was unfolding. On the simple stage, there were no promotional banners, no grand sound system, just a single microphone, a wooden lectern, and a woman who had once scrubbed these very floors, now standing face to face with the company as a whole. Marissa stepped forward, her hand brushing the edge of a folded note inside her pocket, but she didn't take it out. She looked directly at the audience, a sea of unfamiliar and familiar faces woven together. She saw Denise, members of the internal communications team, even 3 of the night shift security guards she had once shared long hours with. And in the very back of the room, seated quietly and without introduction, was Graham Whitaker. He didn't speak, didn't call attention to himself. He was simply there like a silent anchor. "Thank you for being here," Marissa began, her voice low but steady. "I know some of you may be wondering why this meeting is happening, why someone who was once fired for breaking security protocol is now standing here speaking about the future of this company. So let me answer that with something true. I'm standing here because I don't want anyone else to be silent the way I once was." The room fell still. Marissa continued, each word measured and clear. "My name is Marissa Lane. I used to be a night shift janitor in this building. I was fired after performing CPR on Mr. Graham Whitaker when he collapsed in a meeting room. I wasn't thanked. I was shown the door. I was called insubordinate. The media twisted the story. Online forums called me an opportunist. For a while I believed that was the end of my life." A murmur rose from the back right corner of the room. Marissa paused for a breath, then went on. "But I'm still here, and I'm not telling you this to ask for sympathy. I'm telling you this for every person who has ever felt invisible, ever been judged because of where they came from or the job they held. I'm here to say we matter. Not because of our titles, not because of our status, but because we are human." She stepped down from the lectern and slowly walked toward the front rows. Her voice was no longer trembling. It carried a gravity born from the deepest places of memory. "I don't have an MBA. I haven't spent decades managing departments. But I know what it feels like when your child has a fever and you're afraid to call out of work. I know what it is to stand all night in a cold hallway and have no one ask how you're doing. I know the pain of being fired for doing what was right, and that is why I'm here today. Not to polish a report, not to earn applause, but to build a benefits program that gives a voice to those who've never been heard." Marissa stepped back onto the stage. The eyes that had once held skepticism now followed her with quiet attention. A few heads nodded. Someone dabbed at tears. And in that moment she understood she had reached a place not every speech can touch, a place beneath the surface where truth meets memory and something begins to shift. "We cannot change the past," she said, her voice unwavering. "But we can choose how we face it. I'm not a mistake. I am not a shadow. I am a part of this place, and I will not step aside." The room fell into a silence so complete it seemed to press against the walls. Then, without signal or cue, a wave of applause rose up, not led by anyone, but as if everyone had been waiting to let it rise. Marissa lowered the microphone, bowed her head in gratitude. Graham stood, then quietly exited the room, leaving the space to her. This was her story now, her truth. And it was time the company listened. No one could erase her in silence again. Just 3 weeks after that gathering shook the halls of Whitaker and Company, the name Marissa Lane was no longer tethered to the phrase, "the janitor who saved the CEO," as it had once been on half-forgotten online articles. On the cover of a major business magazine, her image appeared beside a project diagram, her hand pointing to a model of an on-site childcare center. The headline read, "From Invisible to Icon: One Woman's Journey to Redefine Workplace Benefits." The story of Employee First. The program Marissa had envisioned and now led had officially launched. No longer a draft locked in a drawer, no longer a trial idea. It had been announced as a core commitment in a live televised press conference by Graham Whitaker himself. Employee First wasn't a policy built by people who had only read spreadsheets. It was born from lived experience, from those who had stood at the bottom of the system, looking up. The first child care center opened on the 3rd floor of headquarters, painted in bright colors, staffed by certified teachers, and designed with flexible hours to support both day and night shifts. The rest area for employees was carved out of old meeting rooms outfitted with folding beds, soft lighting, and a policy that allowed rest breaks without penalty. The emergency fund began with a modest budget, yet it was enough to help a logistics worker pay for his mother's hospital bill, or a single mother at reception repair her car so she could get to work. The press covered the story not just because the program was groundbreaking, but because the woman behind it was. Marissa didn't appear as a figure shaped by a media team. She appeared exactly as herself, a middle-aged white American woman who had once stood in the shadows of a system and now had chosen to turn the light on. In her first national television interview, when asked how it felt to be called a symbol of change, Marissa smiled softly and replied, "I don't think of myself as any kind of symbol. I just think it was time someone said the right thing. And this time I decided not to stay quiet. At Whitaker and Company, the air had shifted. Not everyone had changed, but they had begun to listen. Internal emails were no longer vessels for rumor or passive-aggressive commentary, but windows into lived experience, personal stories, and suggestions coming from every corner of the company, from janitorial staff to IT technicians. One former maintenance worker wrote that the emergency fund had allowed him to keep his apartment after a temporary layoff caused by injury. A receptionist shared how the new childcare center made it possible for her to return to work without worrying about leaving her daughter home alone. And at the heart of this quiet but steady transformation stood Marissa, still arriving by public transit, still eating lunch at the company cafeteria just like anyone else. She had no personal assistant, no leather swivel chair, no soundproof office. But she had something not every executive could claim: genuine trust. Graham Whitaker had kept a low profile since the press conference that launched the program. When asked why, he gave a brief answer to a reporter: "A good leader knows when to step forward and when to step back so someone else can lead." That evening, back in her small apartment, Marissa watched Jacob curled up on the couch reading a book. The boy looked up, smiling, and asked, "Are you going to be on TV again tomorrow?" She laughed gently, shook her head, and said, "No, just back at the office. There's still work to be done." Under the warm light of the kitchen, she knew the journey wasn't over. But this time, she wasn't walking it alone. And this time, the world could see her. That afternoon, in the same small conference room where she had once first shared her bold ideas, Marissa quietly gathered the last project folders of the quarter, preparing for a short trip to a new branch that was about to implement Employee First. Graham Whitaker entered without announcement, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. He set one down on her table, then turned to look out the window where the late-day sun cast a golden glow over the city's rooftops. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice soft-shaped by understanding. He said that back in that meeting room, when everyone froze, it was one person who broke the silence and saved his life. And today, that same person had saved hundreds more by reshaping a system that once ran cold. His words came slowly, as if each one was meant to settle deep into the room. "I saved a man, but you saved a system." Marissa met his gaze, quiet but steady. She didn't answer right away. She simply nodded, a small smile forming at the edge of her lips, then returned to her unfinished files. She knew the road ahead was still long, but now she wasn't just part of the change. She had become the symbol of it. The story of Marissa Lane is not merely a journey from invisible night janitor to head of transformation. It is living proof of the power of courage, of persistence, and of the quiet resilience that carries people through even the darkest hours. She didn't win because of luck. She won because she refused to give up even when every door seemed to slam shut. And the message she leaves for all of us is clear. Never assume that a low position means your value is small. In a system that can forget its humanity, sometimes the person who dares to rise is the one who clears a path for thousands to follow. Dear friend, how did Marissa Lane's journey speak to you? Did it remind you of someone in your own life? Have you ever seen yourself in the eyes of someone overlooked, or perhaps been the one who stayed silent in the face of injustice? We invite you to share your thoughts, your reflections, or even your own story in the comments below. We would be honored to hear what lives in your heart. If this story touched something within you, don't forget to subscribe to Emotional Echoes, click like, and share this story with others. Each day, we bring you moving journeys, meaningful life lessons, and quiet moments of reflection to help you see yourself more clearly. We wish you strength, peace, and joy in every day ahead. Thank you for spending your time with us. Until next time, take care and goodbye.